Hey guys, thanks for checking out the Building Nebraska podcast. So glad that you're here with us today. Here on our inaugural episode, we're sharing with you the story of a man who found himself without a job. He had to pivot quite dramatically. And what he built right here in Nebraska can now be found all across the United States, and they even ship across the globe. It's a story of Baker's Candies. We'll play it here in a second, but want to invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to Building Nebraska if you like this kind of content. That sure helps us get the show out to those who would also perhaps enjoy it. Without further ado, here's the story of Baker's Candies. Welcome back to the Building Nebraska podcast. It's a podcast for dreamers and doers, where we ignite your passion for entrepreneurship and showcase those who turn ideas into reality. Of course, we're powered by the Angler Agribusiness Entrepreneurship Program located at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We're near Greenwood, Nebraska, right on the outskirts of town today at Baker's Candies. You cannot go anywhere in Nebraska without seeing some of these candies. And Todd, the Chief Executive Officer, kind enough to lend some of your time right here on the factory floor to visit with us about this business. This is really cool, and you were telling me, though, people are disappointed when they step in your factory. Looking for a little Willy Wonka action.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say it's an absolute privilege to join you today. Unfortunately, when people get the tour of the chocolate factory for the very first time, they have a hard time hiding those thoughts of disappointment. You come in expecting to see Oompa Loompas and Willy Wonka, Candy Wonderland, and in reality, it looks a lot more like industrial manufacturing than many might want or have even thought to have known. So,
your title is Chief Executive Officer here. You and your brother both involved. You're second-generation chocolatiers, though, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, born and raised in the chocolate industry. It happens to be an odd family trade, particularly for a family from Nebraska. Nebraska just happens to be about the last place on planet Earth that anyone would ever choose to start a chocolate factory, and that's part of the fun of our story, I think. So
why'd your dad do it? Why did he start this, and how did he do so?
Yeah, so it's actually a wonderful story. And it's not the story that most people are expecting. You see, the story in candy is actually always the opposite of our story. The candy story almost always starts with a recipe. Somebody had a recipe for candy, and it was good. And if it was good, then they had to make larger batches. And after a while, people wanted to buy the candy, and so they scaled the recipe into a company. It's really the candy story every time you hear it. Our story is a lot different. It starts with the aerospace industry. My dad actually worked for the U.S. Defense Department. He was a defense contractor during the end of the Vietnam and then throughout the Cold War era here in the United States. Dad worked on the mass production systems that mass produced both the TOW and then the Viper missile systems, which were used by the U.S. government. Being a missile manufacturer had its strengths and weaknesses. As a strength, you had the advantage of the almost unlimited discretionary budget of the U.S. government. But as a weakness, you had to sleep at night, and you knew that you were building enough missiles to blow the world up many times over. And I think that was a thought of conflict for my father. Now, the story always gets mistold. He always ends up designing missiles, and he hates that. Dad actually mass-produced missiles. So he would get a blueprint for a missile system from the U.S. government, and then they'd get an order, maybe 100,000 by Thanksgiving, let's say. And it was his job to figure out how to make that many missiles by that date to that specification and to get the job done. And so he quickly developed a reputation as the get-her-done guy for the U.S. Defense Department throughout the Cold War. The interesting thing about the Cold War, we never fired any of those missiles. It was literally a Cold War. So the missiles were never fired, and they built enough missiles in Lincoln, Nebraska, actually during the Cold War, that they could have easily blown the world up many times over. They never fired any of them. And so eventually defense contractors during the Cold War quite literally worked themselves out of a job. And so my dad in the early 1980s found himself out of work for the very first time in his adult life. And as a mass production engineer, he thought it would be easy to find new opportunities to mass produce things. The problem was the U.S. economy at that time was in a recession. Manufacturing was scaling backward. It wasn't expanding, it was contracting. And so no one was really asking questions like, how do we make more of this? It was actually a matter of how do we cut costs and workforce. This was almost universally true of any industry, save for the chocolate industry. And so here's the introduction to our story. The chocolate industry happened to be this entire industry that had been almost untouched by the Industrial Revolution, and yet business booms in the chocolate industry whenever people get depressed. And it just so happens that during a recession, depressed people bought more chocolate, and the chocolate industry was starting to ask difficult questions about how they scaled the processes by which chocolate was made, particularly the processes used to make gourmet chocolate. The best chocolate on earth to that point had been almost entirely made by hand. So my dad started designing and inventing and building mass production equipment that would change the way gourmet chocolate was manufactured. He did that for a company in Lincoln, Nebraska called Bauer and Blum Chocolates. Maybe some of your listeners will be familiar with the Bauer and Blum story, but if they're not, Bauer and Blum made chocolates in Lincoln, Nebraska. They made a piece specifically called the Bavarian Mint. And they actually, unfortunately, filed bankruptcy before they were ever able to build any of the inventions that my dad had created for them. And so that became that real American gut check moment. He had a file cabinet full of inventions that would change the way gourmet chocolate was manufactured, and now no one to sell them to. So he decided, rather than sell his inventions, we were going to start a chocolate factory. And I'll never forget the day as a 6-year-old boy when Dad walked into the house and said, "Son, we're going to start a chocolate factory." It was about the greatest day of a 6-year-old's
kid's dream, right?
Yeah, it was about as close to a dream come true as you could possibly imagine. And so we started as the very first candy company, we believe, in the history of the world to start with a 100% fully automated custom manufacturing process and no recipe. We literally had no recipe for chocolate. We had a manufacturing process that was more efficient than anybody had ever created before. And then we had the unique advantage of being able to tailor make all of our recipes to work on that equipment. The problem with the candy story, as I alluded to earlier, is that it always started with a recipe. And when the recipe comes first, the manufacturing process has to be tailor-made to augment to the recipe. And so what happens is, as the business scales, the manufacturing process becomes full of inefficiencies. It has to curtail to the recipe. The recipe came first. And any food manufacturer knows you never change a good recipe. Your customers know it immediately. So we had the advantage of having the most efficient process we thought you could ever make gourmet chocolate on. We tailor-made the recipes to the process, and after about a year of trial and error, we were making gourmet chocolate that was better than and cheaper than anything anybody had ever made before, which happens to be a great recipe for a bunch of guys that don't know anything about business. I'm on an entrepreneurial podcast right now, and I'm confessing to you, you won't find a group of entrepreneurials with less knowledge of the subject than we have. We are a bunch of engineers who happen to be running a successful chocolate factory in Greenwood, Nebraska, simply because we're passionate about the process by which candy is made.
So how the heck do you find success? No recipe, not having any, I assume, knowledge about recipes and what makes good chocolate. How did he, in those early days, find that perfect recipe that you're selling today?
Yeah, no, that's an absolutely phenomenal question. So the good news for us in chocolate is that there are no secret recipes when it comes to chocolate. The ingredients that we use are printed right on the bag, as are the ingredients that any other chocolate manufacturer happens to be using. There's no secret ingredients. Instead, the quality of the end product is largely the byproduct of the quality of the ingredients that you use in the process and the system that you use to melt them together. And so that's essentially what we're doing here in our chocolate factory. We changed the way that gourmet chocolate was manufactured. We bought the best ingredients with all the money that we save using that manufacturing process, and we create better chocolate for cheaper, which happens to be a great formula for success when you don't really know what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. When your dad was just starting this out, I'm sure it had to be quite the investment to get this thing off the ground. Has he told you some of those stories about how he was able to make all this come to life? I'm sure with probably some limited resources, but big dreams.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what's really unique is that we actually built the very first production lines in the family basement. So they were built in the basement of the home. Mom and Dad actually stick-built the original chocolate factory, which sits on the other end of town. It was a 5,000 square foot manufacturing space on a vacant lot in Greenwood, Nebraska, where land was cheap and the interstate and Highway 6 happened to be in close proximity. Our family goes back about 5 generations in Cass County, Nebraska, which is why we chose this specific end of Cass County. And the proximity to the interstate made a lot of sense for a manufacturer wholesaler. But the other advantage of being in Greenwood was at that time, land here was very cheap. We built our own building, we built our own manufacturing line. Actually, we built everything from scratch, and we did it all ourselves. one of my dad's core tenets in the business was that he wanted to build a business with no debt. He didn't want to ever have to owe anything to anybody. And so we built humbly with what we could afford, and we expanded with the cash that the manufacturing made. And so we've never had to take a loan to do what we do. And that's been a unique advantage for us in difficult times.
All right, so that's how everything got started. Tell me about the business today.
Yeah, absolutely. So today, I would say I think we broke ground originally in 1986. Today, in the year 2024, the business has been around, getting close to 40 years now. And we've continued to grow every year since the very first year that we entered into production. We've been in business as long as we have, and every single year has been a record year. It's a very unique advantage for us as a business. We know when we start a new year how much chocolate we'll manufacture in that given year. And we also know that everything that we manufacture is going to be sold. There's more demand for the product than energy we have to manufacture it. And so we have a unique advantage of being able to sell everything that we manufacture. And that means that we've grown at a scale that we want to grow. And the growth is dictated by what we as a family can control and what we as a family simply want. We're not motivated by a lot of the things that motivate most businesses. We're under no auspices that we're about to take over the world with our manufacturing process. In fact, we don't have any interest in that. We want to build a family business that serves the family. My mom is an important part of the Baker's Candy story. Mom didn't invent the chocolate machinery. She didn't invent the recipes. But she absolutely instilled the values that the company was built on. And one of those values is that this business will always exist to serve our family, not the other way around. Mm-hmm. So the business has always served the family. In so much as it provides a good life, then it serves a good function. But if and when our family ever starts to serve this business, Mom's on record, she'll burn the place to the ground. And I'm quite confident that she will make good on that promise. And so it's an important part of the values that we built the company on. And that means that to this day, we're exactly the company that we want to be. This year, in the year 2024, we'll manufacture about 50 million chocolate melt-aways here in our plant. That's enough candy to let us run about 4 production days per week. We currently run a 4/12 shift on the production floor. That's about what we want to be running. That provides for a 3-day weekend and a good life outside of the chocolate business, and that's exactly what we're most proud of.
This is part one of our discussion with Todd Baker at Baker's Candies. Now, coming up in our next episode, we're going to talk all about how Baker's Candies has branded themselves as Nebraska's candy and why that's important to their overall marketing strategy. Join us then.